A Build Hatch developed production.
Hello, I'm Aaron Kyle and welcome to another episode of Build Hatch. On this week's episode of Build Hatch, I got to sit down with Steph Richardson in Melbourne, who is an architect from In Between Architecture. I know I say this all the time, but I love hearing the stories behind the people in construction, and I'm sure you will really enjoy understanding the meaning of In Between Architecture. Steph and John have a leading architectural practice in Melbourne, and they're both extremely passionate musicians, so it's no surprise that the mantra in between architecture stems from what happens in between the notes and the sounds during the creation and production of music. Like I said, this is a fascinating episode, and Steph and John at In Between Architecture are working on some of Melbourne's most incredible projects. So let's get into it. Steph from In Between Architecture in Melbourne, welcome to Build Hatch.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's okay. Now, I'm really looking forward to hearing about the history behind In Between Architecture and on some of these really cool projects. So, how did you get into architecture?
Well, I was a late comer. Out of school, I went straight into a music and arts degree. I was quite the performer during my high school days. Architecture
Like,
was not on the radar.
like a particular
Um,
instrument?
no, singing mostly.
Singing.
Yeah, I've been involved in lots of choirs and sort of musical productions. Started in a music degree. I never went into it thinking I'm going to be a famous musician, or a musician
I
as a
was about to
career.
ask that. Yeah.
No, it's just something I absolutely love. And I was concerned that if I did try and pursue it like that, it might become something that I resented rather than something that I loved. So I started thinking about what else I might like to do. So made the really good decision of picking up an arts degree, went to a double degree arts and music, and then at some point decided the music was not going to be what I wanted and finished out my arts degree. But during my arts degree, I did a major in history, and a lot of the history I was looking at was about how we represent history, who writes history, what are the stories we're telling through recording of history. I did a really esoteric subject on the history of the musical, like how musicals came out of opera and that sort of it was, yeah, it's obviously someone's passion project, but I loved it. But I also picked up a couple of subjects in architectural history and just loved it. Like, I just couldn't get enough of it. It was really old school. The professor would just sit in a dark room for 2 hours with two projectors, like old school projectors, and we'd just have two images, and he would talk through what they were, what they meant, how they contributed to the history of architecture. And I just loved it. It was the highlight of my week, and I
Yeah,
did
that's
two of
really
his
interesting.
subjects.
So, like, take me back. Like, for example, like some context around that, like these old images on the projector, and like, how's that sort of
Sure.
told in a story?
So it would be more thematic. So we would look at, I guess, movements in architecture and what buildings or what architects contributed to the development of those different styles or movements, really, more than styles. So I guess it was quite similar to how I was enjoying my history subjects, kind of breaking it down and understanding what contributes to how we understand history.
Like the
Um,
influence of that particular sort of style.
That's right. But looking at it through the lens of architecture, which for me, I really think, architecture is obviously a really strong representation of cultural history. What we build says a lot about who we are as a culture, as a society, what we value, what we don't. So I think that's sort of how I came into it. It fit really easily with things I was already interested in. But also because it was so old school, the assessment was like 100% essay based, and it was choose your own topic and just go, down the rabbit hole and write what you want. So I did one subject. I wrote about Le Corbusier, a huge giant in architectural history, and his brutalist university campuses in, all over, well, on the other side of the world mostly. So that was quite esoteric. And then the next semester, I did a really in depth essay about American domestic architecture, looking at shingle style housing, Cape Cod, like these sorts of domestic architecture languages that like the Hamptons house, that kind of thing that have found their way in some aspects to Australia, but really interested in how the social setting determines how the house is put together in terms of what rooms, do we have the good room? Do you come into a hall? In Australia now, it's all about indoor outdoor connection. Like, what does that actually look like in a house?
So is there
Um,
like you mentioned Hamptons, and I love Hamptons
yeah,
architecture. So what, like, shed some insight into that? Like, what's the sort of, how did that come about, that style
sure.
and
I don't
influence?
I don't know the detail of Hampton specifically, but it's one of American domestic architecture that came about through sort of holiday houses, essentially. They're like lake houses or houses at the coast. And we have quite a culture of that here in Australia, sort of down peninsula and Ballerine peninsulas, looking at what people thought was appropriate for either a holiday house or a house by the coast, and they're quite often quite different from what people are building in the suburbs at the same time. I'm really interested in why wouldn't you just replicate your house at the beach? But people,
Yes,
I think most people kind of go, well, of course you wouldn't. It's a beach house. It's going to be different. And so
it's a
I'm
bit more
really,
laid back or something.
that's right. And
Yeah,
like, and why? What makes it different? And sort of tapping into that rather than saying, oh, I like the Hamptons style. Like that, those sorts of styles came about. They've got more windows than what was being done in suburbia at the time, because assuming you've got some sort of view and you've got sea breezes. Probably it's quite a intense environment if you're close to the beach, so you also need different kinds of screening and protection for your house. Often they would have more like an enclosed porch, so your front door is not straight to the street. You've got this sort of interim space where you're not quite inside yet, but you're sheltered from outside. So just little sort of tidbits like this that really start to tell you a lot about how people were living at a time. And I found that just endlessly fascinating. I would just totally go down a rabbit hole. I always like handwrite my notes, and I would just have books and books of little gems that I'd come across, and then weave it into an essay. And I still, you go back through your university stuff and it's all very embarrassing, and how you thought it was so profound at the time. But those essays I've kept because they were such a passion project for me.
and is
Sorry, that's
that
a very
like,
long way to get to the beginning of my architecture degree. So I finished out my arts degree and knew that I wanted to go into architecture. I'd done no visual art or creative art in high school, so I was already a step behind all the graduates that were coming out at the time. But yeah, managed to get myself into architecture as a mature age 21-year-old student at Melbourne University in their architecture program, and strapped in for another 6 years of study.
yeah, look, it is a long degree, but I'd imagine being right up your alley and literally something that you are really into at the time.
Yeah. And I think at the time I thought, well, it's 5 or 6 years in the rest of my life. Like that's not a lot of time when you're 21. And to make sure that I was doing something that I wanted to be doing. And I was, yeah, very lucky that I was able to, get into a course at that point with not a lot of, graphic and arts background, or, creative arts background.
But it's a
And yeah,
process,
just
isn't
loved
it?
it.
It's that process, like breaking down history, that analysis, that reflective learning, I guess assessing and taking a project and interpreting in your own creative way, like
That's
essentially.
right. Yeah. And I think there is a gap between studying architecture and practicing architecture. And I think coming at it, I mean, obviously you have to study it first, but coming at it from that sort of academic approach suited me because that's where I'd been. I'd been studying already. And I think if I'd come straight out of school into architecture, I wouldn't have survived. I already had some experience in that sort of critical thought, unpacking things. And I guess by that stage, I'd really decided like I'd had to make some big decisions about, is this what I really want to do? It's a big call to say, yep, I'm going back to uni for 6 years. So especially my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, he'd finished uni by then or was just about to, and we were supposed to be like, okay, here we go. And it's like, actually, nah, do you mind if I go back for another 6 years? Um, so yeah, look, I was coming at it from a very certain position that this is what I wanted to be doing, which was good because it was really tough at times. So yeah, but it it was quite different to what I expected. I didn't struggle as much without the artistic background that I thought I might. As I said, like in the academic setting, it's more about the thinking, or equally about the thinking as the doing. So yeah, it was a long course, very challenging at times, long hours, high expectations. Some classes were really full on. The GFC hit during when I was doing my course, and I lost my job. So
Were
there
you
were
were you in architecture, like
yeah,
working
I
on the
worked
side?
in I worked in retail, for a little while, and then the way Melbourne their course was set up then, it's different now, was you did your 3 years undergraduate general building and planning degree, and then you had a year out where you went and worked in a practice as a student. It was the end of that year that the GFC hit, and so when I went back to uni to do my masters, the final 2 years, yeah, there wasn't enough work for me to stay on there, but my subjects that semester were intense. So it kind of worked out well that,
Blessing.
it like I don't know how I would have managed all of it at the time. So things just kind of I played every semester as it came. The level of work was quite variable. It was always full on, but some semesters were more so. And I did feel I had a fair bit of catching up to do with students that had come out of doing um, creative arts and visual arts and were very digital savvy, and but I felt I could really hold my own in subjects that were more critical.
Yeah, that's really cool. So once you had graduated and finished uni, what did you do then?
So where I'd worked as a student, I did was that one semester that I had no work with them, and then I did go back in some part-time capacity for the rest of my masters, which was great. And it was sort of medium-sized firm, so I met a lot of people and got to see a lot of how practice works. I wanted to change. I wanted to go to a different practice because I felt that the way that you're seen as a student, it would be good to go somewhere fresh as a graduate, just because the role, it's quite a different role. So I asked around. Lots of architects are partnered with architects. Asked the people that I was working with, and lots of their partners were in different practices. Well, I've got a few interviews and found a position with another medium sized practice, a bit bigger than where I'd been, which was a really great place to start. Lots of projects.
Did you find it really challenging? Like, I'd imagine someone with so much energy and enthusiasm on the history and the purpose of the project, or the flair of the design or something. Like, I'd imagine you would struggle a little bit with the commercial side back then. Like, was that a real shock for you? The commercial side of the business, like,
Yeah.
it's like people, like, I find, people that I know, that they love designing. It's a bit like running a building business, like actually building the project and getting involved at the start of the job. But then behind the scenes, there's this other aspect to it that someone who has that energy from a building perspective might struggle with.
Well, I guess the beauty of being in larger practice to start with was I had nothing to do with that sort of part of the business. I was really there as a bit player. I did my bit, and the business side of things kind of happened elsewhere. Having said that, where I was a student, because I was cheap, and I wasn't really contributing to their output so much as their paid employee, full-time paid employees. I was paid. I got to go along to heaps of meetings that I wouldn't have gotten to go to if I had been a graduate, for example. and got to see the inner workings, not of the commercial sort of financial side of the business, but the project management and practice management side of it, which um, while I probably wasn't doing as much project work as I thought I wanted to at the time when I was a student, was actually really, really helpful, because when I did go into practice for smaller firms, I had seen so much of what goes on behind the scenes that a typical graduate wouldn't have. Well, someone who'd been sitting at a computer sort of pumping out bathroom elevations and stuff, which is typically what
Yes.
graduates get to do.
Toilet petitions we often talk
That's
about.
right. Yeah, would never have seen. So, and the company I was working for did a bit of commercial work. So, I was in meetings with Major Projects Victoria, negotiating on huge projects. Like, I wasn't negotiating on them, obviously, but seeing how that worked and seeing like really complex stakeholder meetings, and understanding sort of the inner workings of the whole picture, and from a client perspective, in a way that I look back on now and think that was really unique. Like, I was very, very lucky to get that vision on how projects worked. And I guess also that appeals to me. That sort of working at the project from the other side. Like, how do we? It's not just the project for the project's sake. Obviously, it's for a client and it's on a site, and understanding how we get all those wants and needs from the beginning of the project to the end of the project, regardless of what the actual architecture is a project in itself. So that was an interesting aspect of architecture which I didn't know existed until I started being part of it. And again, I guess it wasn't immediately useful, or I wasn't drawing on it immediately when I was in the larger firms, because I was reporting to someone else and they were managing the project. But from that second workplace, and that's where I met John, who is the director of In Between Architecture. We worked there together for some time. When I left that office, I knew I wanted to go to small practice, and I actually spoke to another person we'd all work in that office together, who had gone out on his own, and was doing smaller projects. Um, and I asked him to have a look over my portfolio and sort of coach me to how should I present myself, what should I be trying to put forward to get a role in a practice like his. And after we went through that session, he said, actually, would you like to have a role in my practice? So, which was wonderful. It's I couldn't have asked for more. At the time, I was literally just asking for help, and it couldn't have gone better. So I worked in small practice with him for a few years, and then had a break for family. So I had my first child. And then when I wanted to come back to work after having her, there wasn't as much work around, and I wasn't sure, childcare dramas. I wasn't sure how much availability I had, and it wasn't sort of matching back up to go where I had been. John, as I said, he had started out on his own in that time, and just chatting to a friend of a friend who we'd worked together as well, and I was saying I'm not sure what the next step is for me. And she'd been doing some very casual work with John, but was looking to go into something a bit more permanent, and said, "Oh, John's probably going to be looking for someone soon.
Perfect.
What do you think?" And so, I got in touch with John, and he said, "I don't know how much I have to offer," and I said, "I don't know how much time I have to offer," and that was 7 or 8 years ago. So that's how, right place, right time, right conversations, and just keeping the options open. I think I'm a strong believer, if something's not working, you just change up the scene and get into it. Get different people, get into a different circle, and something will come out of it.
Yeah, I love that, and I love how I think I saw something online where you've had your own influence as well. Where it's, I don't know, I saw a quote and it was something along the lines of music's what's in between the notes,
Yeah.
and yeah, I love that. It's really
So
really cool.
that's that was the impetus for the in-between architecture. John's also a musician. He's a jazz drummer. So both of us have this, musical artistic passion outside of our work, but and heaps of architects do. I think there must be some crossover between sort of patterns and rhythms and I don't know. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's definitely some affinity between music and well, it's a different art form.
Yeah, it's the art
Um,
spectrum.
yeah, that's right. Creative process. And Claude Debussy is a classical composer, mega star of classical music, and that the music is the space between the notes. And particularly for John, playing jazz, yes, the notes are there, but it's that it's that space and that tension and that release and that how you put them together, how you hold them apart, all those things are just as important as the notes that you play, if not more sometimes. Like that's where the drama comes. Two people can play the same thing and it be a completely different thing. So that's where the name came from. And I think our application of that to architecture is really thinking about, yes, there's walls and there's a roof and there's lots of things you can do with those, but why? What do you do with those that creates the space, the feeling in the space, movement through space, rhythm of the space? Like these things are actually, it's our experience of our lives in spaces. You really have to interrogate this idea that's come from music.
Yeah, look, I really love it, and you guys, you and John are well known for your and pardon the pun, but in between spaces. So tell us a bit about the Engawa project.
Sure. So this is a project that we worked on. We worked very closely with the clients. They had a beautiful old home, sort of 100 plus years home, that had had a history of its own. They loved it, but it was starting. Lots of projects start with a kitchen that needs to be redone, right? And they were at that stage, but they recognized that the kitchen maybe wasn't in the right place. It was making the house feel, it was blocking essentially the experience of being inside and being outside. It was right in the middle of the house along the back wall. It meant that there weren't many windows to the backyard. So they asked the question, can we do better? If we're going to redo the kitchen, what could it look like if it wasn't just redone in place? So they came to us with that and a couple of other little things that needed to be adjusted along the way. But essentially, it was looking at the flow of the house. The kitchen was located so that you really kind of had to walk around it to go anywhere. The outcome of it being 100-year-old plus house that had kind of been added and adjusted very ad hoc over its lifetime. There was a toilet opposite the front door that was like under the staircase. You had to take a left under the staircase to get to the other bathroom. You had to go through the bathroom to get to the laundry. It needed just a little like, okay, let's just do
It
a
just
stock take
didn't
here
flow.
and see what's going on. Yeah, it did not flow. Everything was walking around something to get to something else. But there were a lot of beautiful things about it as well. The client, it was their home. They're collectors, they're avid travelers. Um, one of the clients is they're both lawyers, but one does fine arts, beautiful paintings in his spare time. So it was a really rich home. So yeah, we thought, okay, we can do a bit better here. I guess all those influences, you take on board straight away. You're looking at the house, you're thinking, okay, there's lots of artifacts from travel. They've been to Japan many times and love that sort of aesthetic. I think lots of people, it appeals to this sort of calm and orderliness of Japanese architecture. But I think one of the things that really resonates is that Japanese architecture always takes into account the environment, the outside environment, and what can be brought into the house by connecting really authentically with outside. And this house was lacking that completely, uh, partly because of its layout, but also because the site was on a slope. So the back of the house was quite elevated compared to the backyard. So that was our number one site challenge. And then working out the flow was sort of the planning challenge. But John came up with a beautiful way to address both of them in one go, essentially. Engawa, the name of the house, a Japanese building element that's an outdoor veranda, but that is often used as sort of an overflow, sort of spill out space for the interior spaces, often around a courtyard, beautiful sort of Japanese garden setting. So we used that element along the back of this house. Meant we had to add, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it might be like 3 square meters or something, like, nothing, very, very small actual addition to this house. But by creating that zone across the back of the house internally, and then the veranda on the outside, we sort of opened up all these opportunities to access spaces in a completely different way. So we moved the kitchen from the middle of the house, the middle of the back of the house, to the side. So you came into the house and into the middle section, and your kitchen was to the side.
And did
Dining
it
table in
kind
the
of like
middle.
spill out sort of thing, like open up?
Yeah. So instead of walking into the kitchen and walking around it to the dining table, you came to the dining table, and then the kitchen was to the right. So dining is a much easier area to sort of double up as circulation compared to a kitchen. Um, and then that dining space also becomes, where they read the newspaper and where people sort of congregate at the end of the day when someone's in the kitchen, and it's a much more activated space. And because we took that kitchen away from the middle, then we could open up the back of the house in that zone. So from when you're walking in from the front, you can look straight through over the dining table
Like
out to the
beyond,
backyard.
yeah,
That's
out
right.
to the, yeah.
And then putting that Engawa veranda out there gives that transition space. So you're not walking, it's not a giant deck, entertaining deck. It's really a ledge almost. It's only about a meter wide where you can sort of perch on the edge. It's a really casual, non-programmed space that serves a very functional purpose of, there's a set of stairs at the end of it. So you're coming out of the house and being able to come down to the ground level. It's not limiting your options. The clients sort of sit on the edge of it and have a cup of tea. That's where they can kick off their shoes. It's just this sort of transit. Exactly, it's a transition space, and
Yeah, I
it's
love it.
covered. Yeah.
And so
So
people who are listening to this, and we'll put some photos up on our socials,
yeah,
but people who are listening to this, like, what are the materials of that
sure.
space?
So one thing that we often, or one way we find our work kind of our influences coming through it in between architecture, uh, is we'll have the influence, cultural influence or stylistic influence, but it might be translated in a slightly different way, like often sort of uh, make it more contemporary, or use a modern material to do something that's more traditional. So in this case, there's a lot of timber. The idea that this space is really crafted, so it's not slick and everything concealed, and doors on everything. It's really exposed. So we see timber beams inside, and they continue outside. So you get that line running through. They become the rafters for cover of the veranda. The detailing of them, they're stained so that they're not painted, so they're a different color from the plaster and the rest of the house. The kitchen is very conventional, sort of white kitchen, but with a custom timber bench top, and some joinery that was made by the carpenters who worked on the project. The shelving in front of the kitchen, so it all starts to tie together instead of being like these individual elements. All these little parts are sort of talking to each other and reinforcing that it's like Japanese influence, but no one would look at it and say like, oh, this is a replica of a Japanese Engawa. The clients, really did love a lot of the aspects of Japanese architecture. They commissioned a Japanese bath, a cedar bath. Um,
Wow.
there's a crew that make them locally, so they had that made at some point in the project. They decided that's what they were going to do, and that we had that made for the bathroom. And then so we designed the windows around that, so that when you're in that deep tub, the traditional Japanese style, very deep, small but deep, sort of sitting in the tub, you look out of the building. It's not about the bathroom being the hero. It's sitting in that tub and
Yeah,
looking
the
out to the garden.
experience.
Yeah. And the way we designed the bathroom, when you look along the back of the house, that small area that we added sort of created that zone along the back of the house. You look through the bathroom, instead of having that sort of half wall that splits the vanity part and the shower part, we pulled that away from the wall, so you see right through and you see the bath at the end of the corridor and the window beyond. So it's really trying to steal, or not steal space, but increase these vistas and borrow from each space so that the adjacent spaces feel bigger. It's not a big renovation, it's not a big house. Incorporating that outside space gives it a sense of incredible spaciousness for a very modest space.
Yeah, I think if I ask someone, can you explain what this incredible experience would be with engaging an architect such as yourself and your firm, or and other firms, of course, I think you just summed it up perfectly right there and then. That experience and taking all aspects, and that's the beauty of being a client, I guess. To be in that fortunate position where you're sitting there thinking, you know what, like, I can't watch this on TV, or I can't see this on Instagram. I need someone to help influence and create this particular space to get the whole kit and caboodle from this whole experience.
Yeah, well, we're very experience driven, and I think that's the joy for us. Is our first challenge is understanding what the client wants in a more holistic sense than four bedrooms, two bathrooms. Obviously that's important. But what do you want to do in this house? Are you entertainers? Do you have families stay often, or not often, but for prolonged periods of time? How old are your children? Do you plan to stay here for 20 years or forever? These are the kinds of questions we ask our clients before we meet them often. Like we have a questionnaire that we give to our clients. And equally, we're trying to get the information that's important to us, to help design for them on their behalf. Um, but I think also it starts to tell them about what's important to us as designers. We don't ask, "What's your preference, stone or this?" We're saying, "Tell me what your day looks like." Literally, that's what we ask. What does your day look like? Are weekends different? What are your comings and goings? Where do you spend your time? We often, John and I, we're on the same page for a lot of things, and other things we differ. So it's interesting to sort of flesh that out in clients as well. Are you dining table people, or are you lounge room people? Like, where does life happen in your house? And you can, for want of a better word, manipulate that with the spaces that you create. Like, do you want your kids in their bedrooms, or do you want them in living space, general living space? But we know that they probably don't want to be in the general living space at some point in their lives. So how do we make spaces that feel safe and comfortable and inviting at these different stages in life? It sounds like we design very, very specifically, but we're always thinking about the different stages of life. I'm sort of through the very early sort of preschool years now, but I appreciate that when you're in there, you can't imagine that your life is any different, that it won't ever be this series of, do this, do that, do this demands. Um, but it's not that for very long. And there's these whole other layers of life that you need to manage in a family home. We equally work with retirees, for their home, their last home. They're trying to design something that's really them, that they can feel happy and rewarded in, as they're in that phase of their life. So yeah, understanding aspects of the brief that will support the ways that people live, is of utmost importance to us. And then we feel like we just sort of hold all that information, sort of holding all the balls in the air, and slowly each one of them finds a place. It's not always obvious at the very start. There is a bit of trust and faith embarking on an architectural project, I think. And we appreciate that that's not always easy for our clients, and that we need to sort of carry them along that journey with respect and trust, but that not everything will be resolved at the outset. We start with a really big picture and sort of sharpen the focus as the design process goes along.
Yeah, look, it's so important. And, I think it's a reminder too that if you're a builder or a tradesperson and you're working and you're involved in projects, the element of commitment and interest into the actual project is at such a more escalated level. And as you know, I work in the dispute space. So I see a lot of disputes between parties. And I'm sure listening to this conversation, you suddenly appreciate, I guess, from a client's perspective, the element of being so pissed off when things don't get constructed, in a particular way, and you can see why they want, or they, I mean, you and the client,
The
you
team,
want
yeah.
something. Yeah, the team wants something constructed in a certain way with that element of care in mind, because you guys have already created or spent so much time brainstorming and influencing this particular aspect of the job. If it's not built according to that way, well,
It
there's
undoes it.
going to be tension. And
Yeah.
that it's not a case of, well, it's not okay, because you've designed it for that particular purpose or space in mind.
Yeah, and look, it makes it sound like we're very prima donna and everything must be the way that everything's designed and it just go and build it. But I think the way we work, that we enjoy our on-site work the most, is where we're working with a builder that's on the same page, and we have that really sort of natural connection of where it's important to do certain things and where it's less important, because not every detail is as important as the others in our work anyway. Lots of people do things in lots of different ways, but for us the experience is key. So where we've made decisions that influence that, then yes, like they need to be executed in a certain, well, not executed in a certain way. The outcome needs to be a certain outcome, and the way that we best work with builders, and we have a number of builders that we work with over and over because that's how they work. Um, they want to understand from us, what's the outcome that you want? What does this need to do ultimately? And then they'll build it the best way to build that. I'm not the best person to tell them how to build it. That's the builder's expertise. A
Yes.
good builder wants to be challenged to, or an architectural builder. It's not good or bad, but an architectural builder wants to have a problem to solve. Like, oh, I see that's what they want at the end. I've never built that before. Let me go away and have a think about how I can put that together. Um, and the first time this really resonated for me, I was working with a builder, first time I'd worked with him. And when we started on site, he said, I've built this 4 different ways in my head already. Like we hadn't touched a wall, but like he'd already gone through that process of how he was going to achieve the outcome in 4 different ways, so that he'd sort of already tested it hypothetically. And that's music to my ears. Like, you're in this project, you understand where it's going, and you're putting your expertise and your value into how we get there the best way. And it made me realize that we do the same. Like as you said, like we've created it in our imagination. We know what it looks like in here, and like obviously now we use 3D rendering and whatever, so like we can show representation of it, but the feel of it, you really don't get until you're in it, or you're used to designing these things and know what that thing is going to feel like in real life. So many of our clients get to the end and say, oh my gosh, did you know it was going to be like this? And I'm like, yeah. Yeah, like this, yes,
Of course
like
we
this is
did.
what we wanted it, like this was what we were aiming for, this is what we wanted to achieve for you. And I'm so glad that we've got the right team, that it comes to fruition. Um, but yeah, then there are some aspects where we come up against something on site where something's not what we expected, or it's going to be much more difficult to achieve something, and we have a chat with the builder and they say, these are our options, and we say, well, this one's not that important. Like, yes, we can drop the ceiling here to avoid something that we didn't know was there. It's
Yes.
not going to contribute to that overall, to the priorities, the priority things we're trying to achieve. So I think, yeah, it's that two-way. It's like everything, it's such a team. I always say it's such a team sport. Everyone brings what they're the best at, and that's how you get the best outcome.
Yeah, definitely. Or the choir in sync.
That's right. Yep. Everyone plays their part. And I think, yeah, I still sing in a choir now. And the most enjoyable part is when no one's the hero. It's just everyone knows their part. The person who's crafted that music knows what they want the feeling to be. They've put it together in such a way. And when you execute it, you just think, yeah, wow, that was something special. Um, and you've done it together. And that's, yeah, I think, I don't know if COVID kind of sharpened that appreciation. Choir on Zoom is really not excellent, but we got through. But that everyone doing it together, everyone pulling in the same direction, same goals, but bringing very different skill sets and looking at it in a totally different way. That's where you get the best things, and it can just be magic. Just walking into a space and going, like, this makes me feel a particular way every time, or in summer it feels like this and in winter it feels different. Like, those things are really intentional, and it's such joy for us when we get those sorts of feedback from clients over that sort of first year that they're in the house. Like, the sun landed on this thing, on this part of the ground, like you said it would, or, like, I didn't realize the sun would reach this far, or whatever it is. We just think, yes, like, you're really engaged with the space they're living in, and that's just joy.
Yeah, look, I've really enjoyed our chat, and thank you for sharing your story and coming on to Build Hatch. Like I said, it's been a really nice, genuine discussion, and I think people listening to this will no doubt get a lot of inspiration about you and John's architectural practice and what you guys bring to the table. So well done to you guys. Now, if people listening to this want to get into contact with you guys and reach out, what's the best way to go about it?
Best way is through our website. We have a contact form that shoots straight through to our email, and we'll get back in touch with you.
Thank you, Steph, once again for coming on to Build Hatch. It's been really nice to sit down here today in Melbourne and hear your story.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, that was another Build Hatch episode with Steph Richardson from In Between Architecture. As usual, if you know a hard worker having a go in the construction space or a building-related business, person or product where you love what they are doing or selling, then please do get into contact with us, and we'll be more than happy to tell their story and get behind their goods or services on the Build Hatch marketplace. Our team are busy rolling out independent sellers on buildhatch.com as we speak, so stay tuned for more and more products and services as they onboarded. As usual, please check out our Instagram page and other socials, where you'll be able to learn more about our guests and some of the features of the work that we talk about. Have a great week, and you'll hear me again on the airwaves next week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Build Hatch.
You have experienced a Build Hatch developed production.